Remember way back, like in 2003? When Iraq war proponents like Vice President Dick Cheney and Senator John McCain actually were busy trying to convince us that American troops would be greeted as liberators in Iraq. When Donald Rumsfeld not only knew that we would find Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, he even knew vaguely where we'd find them. And Richard Pearl, you remember Richard Pearl, right? Neocon, Cold Warrior, former chairman of the Defense Policy Board, eyebrows of doom, widely considered an architect of the Iraq War. In September '03, 6 months after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, this is what Pearl famously told a conservative think tank in Washington.
A year from now, I'll be very surprised if there is not some grand square in Baghdad that is named after President Bush.
Wow, you think I'm bad at predictions. Do I need to point out that that didn't happen? That may even trump the whole greeted as liberators thing. Consider the diluted about the Iraq war cake to be taken. But you know, we all make mistakes. I bet Richard Pearl felt pretty silly a year after he said that, right? Wouldn't you? Well, here he was when he was asked about it again in February '05. He said, well, I'd be a fool not to recognize that it didn't happen on the schedule I had in mind, so we've lost some time. So let me restate it. I will be surprised yet again if we do not see a square in Baghdad named after this president. Really? The only thing you think you got wrong was the timeline for the great expected Iraqi monument in honor of President Bush? I mean, I can see where you got the whole greeted with respect and affection thing. You know, look, right? They love us. They're destroying the statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdas Square. Except remember, like 3 months later, when whistleblowers told everybody that the whole statue toppling thing was less organic Iraqi joy and more stage-managed event by a Marine colonel and an Army psychological operations team? You know, tomato, tomato. It's now been more than 3 years since Richard Pearl reiterated his prediction that someday the Iraqi people would lionize President Bush with a monument in a grand Baghdad square. Checking back in, well, here's Firdas Square today, the very spot where we saw the choreographed destruction of the Saddam Hussein statue more than 5 years ago. Are these more than 10,000 Iraqis gathered here to sing the praises of their favorite American president? No. They are here at the behest of powerful Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr to protest the proposed status of forces agreement that Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki just signed. It would allow U.S. troops to stay in that country for 3 more years. President Bush did get a shout-out of sorts. That would be a President Bush effigy, and that protester would appear to be whacking Mr. Bush with his shoe, which is a grave insult. Later, the amassed crowd did what any respectable mob of protesters do with any effigy. They set it on fire. So sort of in a way, Richard Pearl was kind of right. I mean, the square is not exactly named in Bush's honor, but President Bush is certainly a prominent presence there. As for that status of forces agreement, the one that more than 10,000 Iraqis protested, well, here's what White House spokesperson Dana Perino had to say about it this week.
This is a mutually agreed to agreement. And that's one of the things that is different about an arbitrary date for withdrawal when you say you're going to leave, win or lose. We believe that the conditions are such now that we are able to celebrate the victory that we've had so far.
Celebrate the victory. You know, just because thousands of Iraqis are unhappy about something doesn't mean we get to call it winning for the United States. First of all, this thing still has to get through the Iraqi parliament. And if it does pass, which it might next week, it sets a date after which U.S. troops cannot stay in Iraq. That's about 3 years from now, which sounds like a timetable for withdrawal to me. And hey, if it means we can finally leave, a lot of Americans would consider that to be a victory of sorts, at least in the sense that we're not getting a permanent occupation like it seemed like they might have been planning for. So who knows? Maybe both Richard Pearl and Dana Perino were sort of right. Bush gets his square in Baghdad, and we get a victory in Iraq because Bush's plans for a permanent occupation don't end up panning out. Joining us now is NBC News' chief foreign correspondent, a man who has logged a lot of time in Iraq, Richard Engel. Richard, thank you so much for coming on the show. Nice to see you.
It's really my pleasure. I've been looking forward to this. How are you?
Great. Although I'm a little freaked out about this status of forces agreement. The UN mandate that allows our troops to be in Iraq legally expires New Year's Eve. So there's a lot riding on the idea that that doesn't become a helicopters off the Saigon embassy moment. That isn't an accidental, abrupt end to the U.S. troop presence in Iraq. Even people who want U.S. troops home worry about it happening that way. Do you think this agreement will pass?
I spoke today with a very senior advisor to the Prime Minister, and he said that it's likely to go to a vote on Monday. The vote could be delayed. It could be canceled. Members of parliament are actually now out of the country, some of them for the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia. Others have said that they will not attend. They're going to boycott the session. So it is likely to take place on Monday, but in Iraqi politics, things tend to slide. If it happens, and there is a quorum held, it will probably pass because the cabinet did approve it. But this is a big deal. I mean, people in this country are focused on the economy and focused on a lot of very legitimate issues.
I'm up at night worrying about this. We've got 150,000 people there.
There are a lot of U.S. troops in Iraq.
Yeah.
It's about 140,000 now. And what this is the exit strategy. Everyone has been clamoring for the Bush administration to put an exit strategy in Iraq. This is it. And it says that if it's passed, U.S. troops will have to pull out of all major Iraqi cities and be on their bases at the end of June. So June 30th, out of the cities. And then it says all combat forces should be out of Iraq by 2012. Not all forces, just all combat forces.
Okay.
So you could leave a residual force around. But what's critical is that you have the Iraqi U.S. troops out of the cities at the end of June. Now, that's a good thing for a variety of reasons. It means U.S. troops won't be doing combat missions, but it means you have a very large force still in Iraq on a training mission, which is a very expensive proposition to have.
On their own, confined to their own bases, with a remit that they charged essentially with training an Iraqi military from bases but Americans still there in the tens of thousands. It seems like sort of a strange thing to plan for. This sort of seems like an animal designed by committee.
It becomes very complicated, and it's not so much of a straight war fight anymore.
Yeah.
In Afghanistan, U.S. troops are on patrol. They're on the offensive. They do what they think is necessary to do to win a fight. Here, it's now a much more bureaucratic endeavor. Iraqi troops and the Iraqi government has the right to search, for example, cargo coming in from the U.S. They have the right to approve missions, as long as they're not carried out in direct and immediate self-defense. They have the right to ask how and where munitions are stored on U.S. bases. So it becomes a lot more complicated.
Do we want our troops in great numbers there under those circumstances? It seems like the sort of thing where it's a big worry if this thing does not pass. It also seems like a really big worry if it passes. This seems like a very difficult circumstances to put 140,000 Americans in.
If it doesn't pass, what happens is the U.S. troop presence becomes illegal.
Yeah.
If on December 31st there was no agreement of any kind, I spoke with the U.S. ambassador there not long ago, and we were talking, and he said, and I asked him, I said, well, what happens? December 31st, there's no agreement, there's no status of forces. He said, we're staying home. We will not leave the bases because anything we do will be considered illegal. So you have this, that would be a very awkward situation where you have the troops there with no agreement, they can't move, so they want to have some sort of framework agreement. But this framework agreement is very complicated. The Israelis have an expression. I covered the Intifada, the Al-Aqsa Intifada in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and they said in that area things used to be broken up into Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A was full Palestinian control. Area B was joint control, and Area C was full Israeli control. The problems were always in the joint control area because nobody knew what was going on.
Right. And welcome to the next 3 years. Incredible. Richard Engel, NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent. I know you're back in New York for a little while. We hope to have you on again to keep covering this as over the next few weeks. A very, very dramatic situation is going to unfold here. Thanks for being here.
It's a real pleasure.
Nice to see you, Richard.